The imprisonment of human beings at record levels is both a moral failure and an economic one. The United States, one of the greatest countries in the world, has a dark secret. Our secret is that on July 4th, 1776, when the framers of our Constitution wrote the Declaration of Independence, they extolled to the world that all men were created equal, endowed by our Creator, and with certain unalienable rights: the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Regrettably, that did not mean the right to freedom. The great U.S. thought they would preserve this perfect union by creating more laws, thus more prisons. Prisons that soon became overcrowded, sparking a humanitarian response of creating more prisons instead of prison reform. And when you desire more prisons, you find partners who offer to solve your problem. Yes, the U.S. partnered with corporate interests in the business of prisons, in the business of making people commodities, similar to the slave trades of old. These partners readily admitted their very existence would be compromised should there be reforms that reduce sentencing, which would ultimately reduce their census and reduce their profitability. The privatization of prisons is also political, with the voices and communities being impacted the most not being heard. On average, there are over 2 million people locked up, and while the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in a short reprieve, resulting in almost a 25% population decrease, these decreases were associated with the result of the pandemic's impact on slowing the judicial process, and not because of any reform. According to prisonpolicy.org, prisons are back in business and are on pace to return to pre-pandemic levels of incarceration. The Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, or the Crime Bill, created incentives for states to build prisons and increase sentences, and thereby contributed to increased incarceration. The Clinton Crime Bill was even controversial among the Congressional Black Caucus. Now, while 2/3 of the Congressional Black Caucus gave Clinton the thumbs up on this bill, there were key members of the Congressional Black Caucus who did not give him thumbs up. In fact, they voted no. That included John Lewis, Maxine Waters, John Conyers, and Charles Rangel.
In order to do it, they talked about this yesterday. In order to do it. Wait a minute. Okay, I heard it. Can I answer? No, you see, here's the thing. I like protesters, but the ones that won't let you answer are afraid of the truth. What she's referring to are the increased sentencing provisions of the 1994 Crime Bill. Here's what happened. Let's just tell the whole story. When I became president, the headlines in the newspapers were full of, now wait a minute, I listen to you, you listen to me. Wait. Here's what happened. Vice President Biden, you guys know Vice President Biden, whose family comes from Scranton. He was the chairman of the committee that had jurisdiction over this crime bill. I had an assault weapons ban in it. I had money for inner city kids for out-of-school activities. We had 110,000 police officers so we could put people on the street, not in these military vehicles, and the police would look like the people they were policing. We did all that. And Biden said, you can't pass this bill, the Republicans will kill it if you don't put more sentencing in. I talked to a lot of African American groups. They thought Black Lives Mattered. They said, take this bill because our kids are being shot in the street by gangs. We have 13-year-old kids planning their own funerals. She doesn't want to hear any of that. You know what else she doesn't want to hear? Because of that bill, we had a 25-year low in crime, a 33 low in the murder rate, and listen to this. Because of that and the background check law, we had a 46-year low in the deaths of people by gun violence. And who you think those lives were? That mattered. Whose lives were saved? That mattered.
According to factcheck.org, Bill Clinton overstated the effect of the crime bill he signed in 1994 when he said, because of that bill, we had a 25-year low in crime, a 33-year low in the murder rate. Independent analysis concluded that the bill had a modest effect on crime rates. Of course, there were those who supported the Clinton crime bill that felt that the majority of that legislation focused on the federal level, and so they were unwilling to accept that mass incarceration resulted from the Clinton crime bill, since only 13% of prisoners were actually in the federal system.
Between 1970 and 2005, the US's prison population grew by a massive 700%, far outpacing both population growth and crime rates. Today, it's got to the stage where America is home to 5% of the world's population, but a quarter of the world's prisoners. And not only does America have the highest imprisonment rates of any country in the entire world, but it also has the highest rate of youth incarceration. Over 130,000 juveniles are detained in the US every year, and on any given day there are more than 70,000 youths in detention. But the biggest winners of this mass incarceration haven't been the American public, but the private prison companies who are making giant profits out of people being in jail. According to the American Civil Liberties Union, in 2010, the two largest prison companies alone received nearly $3 billion in revenue, while their top executives each received annual compensation packages worth more than $3 million. Private prisons didn't really exist before the early 1980s, when US states and the federal government needed a solution to the overcrowding in public prisons. But between 1990 and 2009, the number of people in private prisons increased by a massive 1,600%. And the business model of these private prison companies essentially depends on locking more and more people up. The biggest of the US's private prison companies is the Corrections Corporation of America, otherwise known as the CCA. In its 2010 annual report to shareholders, the CCA stated, "The demand for our facilities and services could be adversely affected by the relaxation of enforcement efforts, leniency in conviction or parole standards and sentencing practices, or through the decriminalization of certain activities that are currently proscribed by our criminal laws." The CCA seems to be particularly concerned about the decriminalisation of drug use and any potential changes to immigration laws. For instance, any changes with respect to drugs and controlled substances or illegal immigration could affect the number of persons arrested, convicted and sentenced, thereby potentially reducing demand for correctional facilities to house them. Because of these concerns, private prison companies spend a lot of money on lobbying politicians. According to analysis by the Associated Press, between 2002 and 2012, the CCA, along with the US's second and third largest private prison companies, Geo Group Inc. and Management and Training Corporation, otherwise known as MTC, spent around $45 million on lobbying state and federal governments between them. And in addition to lobbying, these three companies also pour hundreds of thousands of dollars every year into the election campaigns of governors, state legislators and judges. And a report by the National Institute on Money and State Politics revealed that between 2003 and 2011, the CCA alone hired 199 lobbyists in 32 states, while GEO hired 72 lobbyists in 17 states. Worryingly, private prisons in America have been linked to numerous cases of violence and poor conditions. This CCTV video shows the brutal beating of 24-year-old Hani Elebed by another inmate at the CCA-run Idaho Correctional Center in January 2010. Elebed was left with permanent brain damage from the attack and later died in 2012, though it was unclear whether his death was related to the injuries he sustained in prison. Following the attack on Elebed, the American Civil Liberties Union filed a lawsuit against the CCA on behalf of a number of inmates at the centre. The inmates claimed that violence at the centre was so widespread they called it Gladiator School, and that understaffing and mismanagement by CCA officials was contributing to the violence rates. The CCA denied these claims, but agreed to a settlement in which they were instructed to carry out operational changes and increase staffing levels. However, more than 2 years later, in September 2013, a federal judge found the CCA in contempt of court for violating this settlement. And then the following month, the CCA announced that it would be leaving Idaho. The ACLU has also filed a lawsuit against the state of Mississippi over conditions at the East Mississippi Correctional Facility. Donald Weeks is a former prisoner at the facility, which was run by GEO until July 2012 and is now run by MTC.
It was run by GEO the first 2 months that I was there. Just dirty, nasty, unsanitary conditions. I mean, people get stabbed in there, they're bleeding, or they get in a fight and they're bleeding. They don't give no cleaning chemicals to clean the place up or nothing. The sewer kept backing up in the zones, the toilets kept stopping up. Stench was so bad in there, I couldn't eat anymore.
A spokesperson for MTC says that conditions have significantly improved since the company took over from GEO, but the ACLU disputes this. This track record is all the more worrying because many of those in private prisons are some of the most vulnerable people in the system. Nearly 40% of all detained juveniles are committed to private facilities, while nearly half of all immigrant detainees are now held by private companies. And to be clear, most immigrant detainees are being held while waiting to have their cases decided in court, not serving time for a crime they've been convicted of committing. In 2012, a federal judge transferred all prisoners out of the formerly GEO-managed Walnut Grove Youth Correctional Facility in Mississippi, after finding it to be a picture of such horror as should be unrealized anywhere in the civilized world. Prison staff had sex with imprisoned youths in what investigators called among the worst we've seen in any facility in the nation. According to GEO, the abuses documented occurred before the company had taken over Walnut Grove in late 2010, but this is disputed by the US Justice Department. This map, produced by the ACLU following a Freedom of Information request, also shows allegations of sexual abuse of detainees since 2007 at immigration detention facilities across the US. In total, there have been nearly 200 reports of sexual abuse during this time, but the ACLU believes that this is just the tip of the iceberg and that many other cases have gone unreported. Unfortunately for the private prison companies, however, crime rates in the US have actually been on the decrease for the past decades, and so they've been resorting to more aggressive tactics to make money. A 2013 report from the In the Public Interest Resource Centre revealed that some companies have been signing contracts with states that contain clauses guaranteeing high prison occupancy rates. Some contracts require 90 to 100% occupancy. This means that if the private prisons in question aren't filled to the agreed capacity, then either the state has to find more people to put in those prisons or pay the company for the unused beds. And 3 companies in Pennsylvania even resorted to bribing officials to get beds in their facilities filled. In August 2011, Former Luzerne County Judge Mark Chivarella Jr. was sentenced to 28 years in prison after sending children to detention centers owned by these companies in return for illegal payments amounting to millions of dollars. Some of those he sentenced were as young as 10 years old. And now, campaign groups like the ACLU and Brave New Foundation fear that private prison companies could be set to profit from federal immigration reform. The US House Judiciary Committee has passed the SAFE Act, which, if turned into law, would turn millions of undocumented immigrants into criminals overnight and make not having papers punishable by months or even years in US prisons. But if business starts to go bad for the private prison companies in the US, then there's always the rest of the world. The UK currently has a 106% prison occupancy rate, creating an opportunity for private prison companies to jump in as they did in the US in the 1980s, while Australia's controversial immigration detention system is now operated entirely by private companies. And last year, Geo saw 14% of its revenues coming from international contracts.
The United States is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. Think about that. Our incarceration rate is 4 times higher than China's. We keep more people behind bars than the top 35 European countries combined. And it hasn't always been the case, this huge explosion in incarceration rates. In 1980, there were 500,000 people behind bars in America. 500,000 people in 1980. I was in college in 1980. Many of you were not born in 1980, that's okay. I remember 1980, 500,000. Today, there are 2.2 million. It has quadrupled since 1980. Our prison population has doubled in the last 2 decades alone. Now, we need to be honest, there are a lot of folks who belong in prison. If we're gonna deal with this problem and the inequities involved, then we also have to speak honestly. There are some folks who need to be in jail. They may have had terrible things happen to them in their lives. We hold out the hope for redemption, but they've done some bad things. Murderers, predators, rapists, gang leaders, drug kingpins. We need some of those folks behind bars. Our communities are safer thanks to brave police officers and hardworking prosecutors who put those violent criminals in jail. And the studies show that up to a certain point, tougher prosecutors and stiffer sentences for these violent offenders contributed to the decline in violent crime over the last few decades. Although the science also indicates that you get a point of diminishing returns. But it is important for us to recognize that violence in our communities is serious, and that historically, in fact, the African American community oftentimes was under-policed rather than over-policed. Folks were very interested in containing the African American community so it couldn't leave segregated areas, but within those areas, there wasn't enough police presence. But here's the thing. Over the last few decades, we've also locked up more and more nonviolent drug offenders than ever before for longer than ever before. And that is the real reason our prison population is so high.
With prisons, I do think we can do a lot of privatizations and private prisons. It seems to work a lot better.
With this statement, Trump has proven once again that he doesn't know what he's talking about. Or he likes the fact that greedy corporations are making billions of dollars locking people up, while violating their basic human rights, and wants more of it. Currently, the $5 billion private prison industry houses about 6% of state prisoners and 16% of federal prisoners, according to the ACLU. Unlike their public counterparts, private prisons are accountable to investors and hedge funds, not just taxpayers, making profit, not rehabilitation, the #1 goal. After lining the pockets of shareholders, revenues are used to create more beds and aggressively lobby state and federal governments to deliver more prisoners to fill them. In fact, government contracts granted to private prisons often require minimum occupancy rates between 80 and 100%. Moreover, a 2015 study found that inmates in private prisons are likely to serve as many as 2 to 3 months more behind bars than inmates in public prisons. Because of the profit motive, private prisons are also typically more violent, filthy, and understaffed. In fact, in a 2013 lawsuit, the ACLU called one private prison an extremely dangerous facility operating in a perpetual state of crisis, where prisoners live in barbaric and horrific conditions, and their basic human rights are violated daily.
Today, I'm also issuing an executive order that will ultimately end the Justice Department's use of private prisons, an industry that houses pretrial detainees and federal prisoners. The executive order directs the Attorney General to decline to renew contracts with privately operated criminal facilities, a step we started to take at the end of the Obama administration and was reversed under the previous administration. This is the first step to stop corporations from profiting off of incarceration that is less humane and less safe, as the studies show. And it is just the beginning of my administration's plan to address systemic problems in our criminal justice system.
While Biden's order will affect the 11 private prisons currently under contract by the Department of Justice, as well as the larger private prison industry, it will not actually free any people currently housed therein, and only impacts a small slice of the U.S. prison population. States will also be free to continue contracting with private prisons.
As crises like these are unfolding, the first step to fixing them is to take note of something abnormal in society and then to acknowledge that a problem exists. Because it's only then that you can dissect the problem and move to seek solutions. So let's identify something strange in the United States. Something that doesn't seem right. The U.S. has around 1/20th of the world's population, yet over 1/5 of the world's prison population. For every 100,000 residents, around 700 are incarcerated. This is the highest rate in the world, and about 4 times the similar figures for Europe in 2013. 2.2 million people are in jails or prison in the U.S. 4.6 million are under surveillance due to probation. 70 million have an arrest record. Abnormal statistics like these, in comparison to the rest of the world, are a red flag that something is wrong. Not unlike noticing startling rates of cancer among those who smoke compared to those who do not. And when we identify that something is wrong, outside the normal variations we expect, that's when we should begin asking about the system in question. Is it helping society get better, or is it making things worse? People are incarcerated for crime. At least, that's the simple version. Lots can be said about the nature of those crimes and the laws around them, but at the end of the day, incarceration is a response to what society deems criminal behavior. Society does something to people to reduce the chances they will offend again. So what happens to people incarcerated in the US? Lots of things, but to make a long story short, they don't do so well. For the US, the combined state and federal correctional systems double as the nation's largest mental health institution. Almost half of the inmate population in the US has been diagnosed with a mental illness, and over half of those are considered especially serious. These diagnoses are first made almost universally during incarceration, and on average, diagnoses of clinical depression, anxiety, PTSD, and personality disorders occur around 2 years in. These findings suggest that people with mental issues are not receiving help until they are already in prison. Or worse, that prison brings out these disorders in people. In a society in which jokes about molestation in prison are commonplace, the latter assessment doesn't seem all that unlikely. As far as physical health goes, the effects of incarceration on the individual are, again, not good. In the conditions present in U.S. prisons, cases of cardiovascular disease seem to be especially high. Even when corrected for race and socioeconomic factors, recent releases from prison have a higher risk of death or hospitalization due to cardiovascular disease. This is attributed by the Journal of the American College of Cardiology to low-quality healthcare combined with a sedentary lifestyle enforced by constant confinement and limited autonomy for healthy behavior, such as access to nutrition. Now, at this point, some of you may be thinking, not without warrant, why should we care? After all, many of these people are criminals. Isn't this supposed to be punishment? But that's just it. Punishment is only one aspect of a broader system, the goal of which is to make society healthier and to prevent people from committing crime in the future. If that isn't the point, then what is? Are we spending money purely to punish people? Again, if punishment doesn't improve the actual problem, then what are we doing? More importantly, though, what if it makes it worse? Across the board, it has become abundantly clear that suffering breeds crime, and crime breeds suffering. When people are physically or mentally in a state of despair, regardless of how they got there, that's when bad decisions and quick gratification become easy. So, considering how our system leaves people in just that state startlingly often, is it any wonder that we're not getting the results we're after?
You can sleep at night believing your tax dollars are keeping you safe by keeping federal prisons across the country filled with violent criminals, drug kingpins, and dangerous hardened convicts. But what if that wasn't the truth? What if the truth actually kept you up at night? What if the truth was that federal prisons are not filled with violent criminals, but that 87% of all federal inmates are in for nonviolent offenses, and that half of all federal prisoners are there for drugs? What if the truth was that in 2012, only 10 people were convicted under the Kingpin statute, and of those serving time for drug offenses, 93% played no leadership role at all? And what if the truth was that you, the American taxpayer, are paying billions of dollars each year to lock up mostly small-time, nonviolent offenders, and this is threatening you and your family's safety? Could you still sleep at night? The truth is, since the creation of lengthy mandatory minimum drug sentences in the 1980s, the federal prison population has exploded by over 800%. Every dollar spent locking up nonviolent offenders for too long is a dollar that can't be spent on law enforcement, investigating violent crimes, and victim services. The truth is, you won't be as safe as you think you are until we have the kind of sentencing reform that will save you money and make us all safer.